It's another Kangaskhan deck, and a base rocket deck, which I have not done in a minute. In the last deck video, I talked a lot about Kangaskhan, its merits, its usefulness, and we kind of came to the conclusion that Fetch is a great utility attack to have on a Pokemon that's going to be sponging up a lot of damage for you. But drawing a card for 1 energy isn't very impressive in a format where you can draw through your entire deck using Professor Oak and Bill. Well, I got some good news for you, because when the Rocket set dropped, the metagame got very anti-trainer. But an attack that lets you draw a card starts to look real good when the Bills and Oaks in your hand aren't playable anymore. This is a format where I really think Kangaskhan started to overtake Chansey and Lickitung for that title of Best Big Normal. This deck in particular, utilizing Dark Vileplume, allows you to cut off your opponent's card advantage while keeping yours going, all the while soaking up minimal damage as your opponent struggles to get energy and evolution cards onto their side of the field, and setting up for your own heavy comet punches mid to late game. I made sure not to spoil the entire premise of the build in the thumbnail, so hopefully there's some nice little surprises in there. Let's go ahead and have a look. The first surprise is that Abra's in this deck. A full playset of them actually, so we are actually running a 4-3-3 line of Alakazam. Base Alakazam, yes, this is a damage swap deck, just to stack onto the frustrations your opponent feels from not being able to play trainers. On your side of the field, you're just drawing cards with Kangaskhan, you're moving damage counters with Alakazam's power, which can be incredibly frustrating because I've already said without your trainer draw power, it's really difficult to get that ideal setup, especially if Dark Vileplume is hitting the bench on turn 2. The first thing that comes to mind is a matchup against Wigglytuff, where Wigglytuff wants to play trainer after trainer after trainer to get that full do the wave setup as quickly as possible. But if you can get down the Dark Vileplume before a Wigglytuff deck starts to ramp up, oh, you can stop it cold, especially since a Wigglytuff is most likely not going to be able to OHKO a Kangaskhan. So next turn, you can just damage swap all of that damage off, spread it around your other Pokemon, and keep flaunting your own draw power and your ability to set up because of it. So we're also going to be running a 4-3-3 line of Dark Vileplume. Rocket Oddish and Dark Gloom are very respectable cards in their own right, so they're extremely useful if you have to start the game with them. Unfortunately, this deck does not use any grass energy, so you won't be able to utilize Oddish, but having it as a 50 HP basic is a lot more preferable to start out with than Abra. And this deck is going to seem pretty Pokemon heavy for a Rocket deck, but you have to remember you're going to be getting down this Dark Vileplume as quickly as possible, so you're using all the trainers you can within your first couple of turns before you actually slap that thing down. So why overload your own deck with a bunch of cards that you're not going to be able to use? And we're actually going a full playset of Kangaskhan here, so hopefully you do get one in your opening hand to start the game with. That way you're not having to worry about retreating around to get your first fetch off. It's a lot more streamlined and ideal to just start the game with a Kangaskhan in the active position, because that's automatically going to put pressure on your opponent. They're staring down a 90 HP basic that can draw. And by this point, if you have an Oddish on the bench, they've probably already realized what the rest of your setup is. 2 copies of Chansey that are also going to serve as a sponge, just something to move all of those damage counters off of Kangaskhan onto. Snorlax is going to be kind of similar. It's another one of those big basics that never sees a lot of play, but that thick skin power is another one that got way more powerful with the drop of the Rocket set, because cards like Dark Gloom and Drowsy became a lot more prevalent and special conditions were a thing, whereas in base Fossil you barely saw any special conditions being used. The trainer base is very straightforward, full playsets of Computer Search, Bill, and Oak. That way you are drawing as many cards as possible before you get the Dark Vileplume into play, just because you're not going to be using those trainers late game. The only reason to use full playsets is to guarantee that you're getting at least a few of these draw and search cards very early game. Same thing with Pokemon Trader, where you want to make sure you're getting the exact setup that you want right then. So don't worry if you're burning through half of your deck just to get that setup, because the game is going to slow down significantly as soon as Dark Vileplume hits the bench, and your opponent's going to know that too. Pokemon Breeder is going to allow you to get that set up so much quicker too, because you can get the Alakazams to start damage swapping, you can get the Dark Vileplumes down as early as possible. And that's gonna have to be the strategy when you know you're up against an extremely aggro deck, like a Mewtwo deck or Wigglytuff. Maintenance is mainly in here because I had a couple of card slots open, didn't know what else to put in there, thought maintenance was a pretty good idea. So, for Kangaskhan, we're gonna be using a full playset of double colorless energy in here, so that it can be a big damage threat as early as turn 2. And if you're getting Dark Vileplume into play super early, then you don't really have to worry about energy removal knocking those double colorless energies off. Because this is a rocket deck and special conditions are expected from the other side of the field, we'll also use a full playset of full heal energy. They're not always going to be useful, but when they are, they come in pretty clutch. And then finishing off the deck with 3 copies of Rainbow Energy, just in case you do want to utilize Oddish and Gloom as attackers. And you're going to have an Alakazam to damage swap away that damage counter anyway, so it works out. Of course, this deck and a lot of other really fun ideas in the TCG are just completely ruined by Muck. And Muck isn't an end-all, as a lot of decks around this time were only running like a 1-1 or a 2-2 of Muck. But this particular Kangaskhan build does not run Gust of Wind, so it's a lot harder to actually knock out those Grimers before they can evolve. But it really only takes one turn of Hay Fever being turned off for your opponent to dump all the trainers they have in their hand and take momentum back. Mr. Mime is another decent addition that you could add to this deck to help deal with opposing fighting types, or just as a failsafe for any of your opponent's Pokemon that are able to start dealing out big chunks of damage. Scoop Up and Pokemon Center are also pretty good options for if you fully want to lean into the damage swap aspect, but Kangaskhan and Chansey both have so much HP that you're not really going to get more use out of the maybe a 2 of either of these cards. Because if you get the full setup with this deck very early on, which you can pretty consistently do, you're not going to be taking on a ton of damage from your opponent because they require setup to do so. They need the draw power to get those energy cards to power up their Pokemon. I actually had a lot less to say about this deck than I thought. You know, the general premise is pretty solid. You cut off your opponent's access to draw power so that Kangaskhan can shine with its own, all the while keeping it alive and active as an attacker by moving damage counters off of it as it receives them, not having to live in fear of getting hit with a gust or an energy removal from your opponent. So as always, let me know what you thought about this build down in the comments. Let me know if you have any specific decks or Pokemon you would like to see featured on the channel. Social media links in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next video. Bye. It's a Wigglytuff video, that's what the next one is.